Do the Tigers have what it takes for a 3-game winning streak in the SEC? Well, who better to ask than Lance Daw of Locked On Kentucky, coming up right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And joining me today on another special Locked On crossover, it's Lance Daw of Locked On Kentucky. But you know what, before we get to Lance, I do have to remind you that this episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. The terms and conditions apply. And Lance, I tell you, I've been thinking about this football game a lot right before we got on the air here, and I'm curious to hear how you think about it. I kind of want to just look at it from this perspective. I think whoever runs the ball the most effectively is going to win this football game. I think you've got two really good defenses here, and I think whoever is able to make those third down conversions just a little bit shorter, I think that's going to be the difference. How are you looking at this ball game? What matchups are you looking at?
Well, I think stylistically, first and foremost, I want to point out that you just look at the numbers, just the simple basic numbers, and these two teams are actually pretty similar. Both are averaging right at 23.9 points per game. Both are giving up 311 total yards per game on defense. Both very similar in terms of yards passing and yards rushing. I mean, a lot of people want to make a lot about, Kentucky and Will Levis and what they've done so far this year. And I think kind of the perception maybe heading into this game is that Kentucky is just overall a better team. I think matchup wise, when you look individually at different places, but overall, these teams are not very different in the way that they've operated so far this season. I agree with you. I think when you look at the running game for both of these teams, I think it's going to be very important in this matchup. Kentucky's offensive line has been a huge question mark so far this season. They've not been able to run the ball. And even though they got Chris Rodriguez back just a couple of weeks ago, he's been able to play well at times, but that offensive line, it feels like, is holding him back in certain situations. So I think this is one of those games heading into it just right off the top. This is one of those where I think pacing and controlling the ball and converting third downs and just being the more physical team is probably going to make this game not necessarily a one-sided affair, but I come into this game, John, with a lot of concerns about how Kentucky's operating up front. And so you look at Kentucky or Missouri, you can tell me a little bit about their backfield here in just a second, but it feels like from a matchup perspective, Missouri should win that battle. What do you think?
Well, that's interesting. Now, just to be clear here, you're talking about Missouri with having the ball here offensively?
Yes.
Okay, so, they went to full time. They had been sort of going back and forth between running backs. Last week, they really went with Cody Schrader, the Truman State transfer, a guy who is, Division III, something like that. A guy who's played pretty well, though, and most importantly, I think from Drinkwitz's perspective, has held on to the football. But my real question with Missouri is offensively is much like yours with Kentucky. They've struggled a bit up front on the offensive line as well. I thought Missouri probably had its best rushing output last week of the season overall, just especially in terms of efficiency and just not losing play, not having plays that lose yardage on first and second downs, and just get this type of offense in deep trouble on third and longs, that type of thing. So to me, it's really up in the air if Missouri is going to be able to run the ball against Kentucky. What's interesting about Kentucky and Missouri is both teams are, I believe, you look at just about any advanced statistical category, overall they're top 15 units defensively, but they do it really differently. Missouri plays a lot of man-to-man. They're aggressive. They blitz. Kentucky, meanwhile, much more zone, much more two safety stuff. And correct me if I'm wrong, more of a 3-3-5 kind of look,
Yep.
3 down linemen, that kind of deal. So to me, what Kentucky does is pre-snap, you think, oh, we should be able to run the ball, but not so fast. Sort of like Kansas State did. Missouri actually really struggled in the running game. Brady Cook couldn't take advantage of scrambles against Kansas State either, against that heavy zone concept in the 3-3-5. I don't know. What do you think? How do you think Missouri matches up against this particular defense? Because I think this Missouri offense is probably going to struggle against Kentucky.
Well, both these run defenses for Missouri and Kentucky are both top 5 units in the SEC. And you talk about stylistically and from an X's and O's standpoint, what they like to do. You're right. Kentucky does like to run that kind of 3-3-5 look, and a lot of it has to do with personnel. They've got 3 really solid linebackers, and they've got 2 safeties that they trust in Tyrell Agent, and Jordan Lovett. They've got a really solid secondary and a really solid linebacking core, and so they've kind of relied on those guys a little bit more than the defensive line. And I'm not sitting here saying that anybody on the defensive line is bad. I'm just saying I think Kentucky's kind of tailored their scheme to kind of, complement some of these different guys' skill sets in this second level of the defense. So I think from a matchup perspective, if you're looking at the way that Missouri, may want to attack this, you're saying that they may struggle. Sure, I think that these teams may struggle against each other, but I go back to, again, I just have so little faith in Kentucky's offensive line that while statistically it may not be an impressive performance on the ground for either of these two teams, I still right now give the edge to Missouri. And so I think that you have to then ask the question, John, okay, if maybe both of these teams are having to throw a little bit because they can't get things done on the ground, which quarterback do you trust more? I want to get your thoughts on this because over the past 2 or 3 weeks, Will Levis has performed terribly. And we saw what he did against Tennessee last week, 3 interceptions, didn't eclipse 100 yards passing. He's just not been efficient. And part of that has been the offensive line. Part of it has been his own doing. And Brady Cook, 6 touchdowns, 7 interceptions for you guys so far. I'm not particularly, disappointed in Brady Cook. I think he's got actually one of the best QBRs in the SEC, if I'm not mistaken. What do you think about this quarterback matchup, maybe having to throw against each other a little bit?
Well, I think it's interesting because, like you said about Levis, I think he's had a disappointing season. I'd say he's a little bit banged up, I would say, too. It's sort of a bevy of different injuries. I know he's had a bit of a shoulder issue against, I think it was, I can't remember the opponent. I was going to say Auburn, but he had a finger get messed up,
Yep.
I believe, on his throwing hand even. So, just a lot of issues there for Levis so far. My real question is actually more of a receiver question, because I know Josh Ali's gone from last year. Wan'Dale Robinson has moved on to the New York Giants. Does Kentucky have a player that you think can beat Missouri deep at all, challenge that secondary? Because I really like Missouri's corners.
I think they've got a couple different guys that, could potentially test them deep. Berrien Brown and Dane Key are 2 freshman receivers on the outside for the Wildcats that have been impressive at times this season. Berrien Brown has a 70-yard score on the year. Dane Key had a 55-yarder, I believe, against Florida, where Kentucky at times, they seem kind of skittish to maybe attack downfield with some of these young receivers. Again, part of it has to do with the offensive line, in my opinion. But yes, I think these 2 guys, specifically Berrien Brown, he is a speedster. He's a track star, very elite on the outside. I think Kentucky's got the weapons in Berrien Brown and Dane Key to test the Tigers secondary. I think the question, though, you have to ask is, can they actually get the time to do it? And
Right.
I don't necessarily know if they're going to be able to. The other receiver I think you need to talk about here for the Wildcats is Tavion Robinson. He's more of a slot guy, more of a possession guy, probably not going to be stretching the field, but yards after catch is something that you really need to keep an eye on with him. But he's not somebody that you just go line up on a streak or on a post and say, all right, have at it. He's more of a possession type of guy. I mean, you talk about the receivers, though, in this contest, John. Y'all have got a couple really talented ones as well.
No, we certainly do. And I definitely want to talk about those guys. And also I want to talk about the total, the betting line coming up on this program. But first, speaking of wagers, I'll tell you, Lance, excuse me, these days, every new potential hire can really feel like a wager, a big time high stakes wager. for your small business, well, you want to be as close to 100% certain as you can that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. Well, that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because with simple tools like screening questions, they make it easy for you to focus on the candidates with exactly the right skills and experience you need, and you can quickly prioritize exactly who you'd like to interview and hopefully hire. So LinkedIn Jobs, once again, helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Well, Lance, you mentioned those receivers for Missouri. Obviously, Luther Burden has gotten tons of press the last couple years or so as one of the highest ranked high school receivers, big time hype. But really, Dominic Lovett, his, well, not teammate, but they went to the same high school. Dominic Lovett has been really, really good. I mean, I'd say one of the handful of best receivers in the entire conference. But sort of like you, Lance, on the other side of the ball, I do have to wonder, with that Kentucky defense, are they going to be able to have time, number one? But number two, even when they do have time, I just worry again. It sort of reminds me of the Kansas State matchup a little bit, sort of a similar defense. And Brady Cook and the entire offense struggled. So that's still in the back of my mind. That's just something that worries me a little bit. Now, when it comes to the total of this ball game, by the way, our friends over at betonline.net, at last check, 40.5 total. You know, I've been red hot, Lance, going under in Missouri ball games. I think I'm finally going to stay off of that one. I think Vegas has finally caught up to it. But do you see this being that low scoring of a game?
I think it hovers somewhere around there, and we can give our final score predictions in just a little bit. I think the over is going to hit by a few points. I don't see these teams scoring a combined 41 or less. I think that, as we've kind of discussed up until this point, it's not necessarily sure, statistically, I think these defenses are sound, but it's not necessarily like, oh, this is going to be a really, really nice defensive affair. It's just the offenses have some deficiencies that are going to really play into what these two defenses do really, really well. So I think that there will be at times issues scoring, but the over is going to hit, in my opinion. And then you talk about the spread there. BetOnline currently has it at 1. Some other places have it hovering around that as well. For Kentucky to only be favored by 1 point in this game, I think a lot of Wildcats fans were initially shocked by that. ESPN's FPI only gives Kentucky a 51% chance to win this game, so it's literally just a coin flip. As far as vibes go, John, heading into this game from a Missouri perspective, what's kind of the approach to this? I mean, the Wildcats have won the 6 out of the last 7 games in this series, but this feels winnable, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does. And I think, again, it is on the back of that Missouri defense. I just think they've proven that they can hang with just about anybody. You know, like I said, that Kansas State game aside, you know, I mean, they hung in there with Georgia for basically the entire game until the fourth quarter. Georgia found some success, changed some things up on the ground. And, you know, frankly, probably the defense wore down a little bit. So I think if you can just avoid that, I think you're looking at a close ball game. You know, would I favor Kentucky? Well, you know, I'll give you my, again, final segment. I'll give you my final prediction here. But as I'm leaning right now, it is hard not to think that, you know, Mark Stoops just kind of owns the Tigers a little bit. And, you know, here's one thing I'm curious about. That 3-3-5 defense, just that Kentucky defense in general. Is there a weak spot in it? And if you were Missouri, how would you go about attacking it?
Well, I would say 2 things just to kind of make you feel a little bit better. You talk about that Kansas State game, a lot of turnovers in that game for you guys. Kentucky, one of the worst teams in not just in the conference, but in the country in terms of creating turnovers. They've just simply not been good. I believe they have 8 takeaways on the year so far, which is good for 12th or 13th in the league. Missouri, probably not going to be too concerned with Brady Cook throwing a ton of interceptions in this game or a lot of fumbles in this game. I know that y'all have had some fumble issues in some really close games so far this year. And then also you look at these offensive lines, right? And we talked about the inefficiencies with both of them, but Kentucky's not done a great job at actually getting home in sacking the quarterback. They're 11th in the SEC in sacks per game. I would say if you are going to pick a specific unit on this team, on the defense that maybe has a little bit of cause for concern, again, I go back to, I think it's got to be the defensive line. Justin Rogers and Octavius Oxidine they haven't been particularly impressive this year. They've not been bad by no means, but they've just not done as much as maybe some fans would have liked them to. And again, pressure, creating turnovers, it's not their strong suit. I think Missouri should be able to operate comfortably from that standpoint. Now, again, it's going to be, I think, a little bit difficult for both these teams to move the ball at times, but there's not going to be a fear, I think, in the back of Missouri's mind that all of a sudden Kentucky's going to turn it up to 11 and they're going to be able to get home consistently. So, yeah, I think the defensive line and then just understanding that not a lot of havoc on the Kentucky side so far this season.
Well, that is encouraging from a Missouri fan's perspective. But you know what, Lance, I think we should make our final predictions. But first, I do want to tell you about betonline.net. Of course, as Lance said, Tigers 1-point underdogs currently, basically a pick 'em. Lance thinks the total's going to go over. To me, that's just a stay away. I gotta end my streak of picking Missouri to go under successfully, I might add, for basically every game this season. Hey, all good things come to an end. But you know what? Whether you're into college football, maybe NBA basketball's your thing. Heck, the World Series is going, hockey's going, golf, mixed martial arts. The Paul brothers are probably fighting somebody at some point. The point is, they've got you all covered over at betonline.net, where the game starts. All right, it's prediction time, and being the generous host that I am, I'm going to let Lance go first and give his prediction on this Missouri-Kentucky game. Lance, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that, you look at the series history, not a whole lot of history between these two teams. They've only played, 12 games so far in their history. Kentucky's kind of dominated the series recently. Again, like I mentioned, 6 out of the last 7. This feels like one of those games where Kentucky desperately needs to get right. They've got the pieces to do it. It's just, can they actually go out there and execute against an opponent that they've consistently beaten for years now? I have a really hard time with this game, John. I do not have a good feeling about it. Ever since that South Carolina game, I've just kind of been, really, really nervous about every contest that Kentucky's gone into. I have a hard time picking the Wildcats to win this game, but I'm going to pick it close. I think 24-21 will be the final score in this game in favor of the Wildcats. While special teams have been a massive concern for the Wildcats so far this season, I think they are going to finally clean up a couple different things in this game, actually maybe make a field goal or an extra point, which sounds insane to some Kentucky fans, but I believe it's actually going to happen. Maybe get some of these receivers on the outside going at different times against Missouri's defense. Look, it's going to be a back and forth affair. I think it's going to be close, but I think Kentucky and Mark Stoops, they're going to find a way to coach themselves out of this one, despite some of the inefficiencies on the offensive line. Will Levis, does he have maybe a get-right game? I don't necessarily think so. Statistically, I don't think he's going to be crazy impressive on this day, but he will be one of the reasons that Kentucky is, at the end of the day, able to pick up the dub.
I went into this episode planning on picking Kentucky, I have to admit, but after talking to you, Lance, and getting maybe a little bit more information on that defense, I think I'm going to go with Missouri here, winning 16-10 in a really low-scoring ball game where each team gets one offensive touchdown. The Tigers, on the back of Harrison Mevis, who's been a little bit shaky from short yardage, well, he hits 3 50-yard field goals. The Tigers win it, and nobody's exactly going home and saying that was the prettiest football game I've ever seen in my life. But I just think that Missouri matches up really well defensively with what Kentucky is trying to do offensively. To me, if they're going to win, if Kentucky's going to win, I think they're going to need to get, let's say, 5 yards a carry from Chris Rodriguez. If they can run the ball that effectively, I think the Wildcats will win. The problem, I think, for Kentucky is Missouri is going to commit a lot of guys to the box. And I have confidence in Chris Abrams-Drain and Ennis Rakestraw on the outside that they're going to make those receivers' lives difficult, at least difficult enough that they hold them down to, say, 10 points, 13 points, something like that. That's just the feeling I've had this whole time. To me, it's just a question of, does the Missouri offense do enough? And for some reason, I think with probably a good Missouri crowd behind it, I think they do just enough to win.
And I definitely think that that's a fair stance to take into this game because look, Kentucky's kind of lost their momentum early in this season. People were really excited about the Wildcats. They were a top 10 team at some point. They've lost 3 out of their last 4. They've had injuries. They've had fall aparts on special teams. This is a game where Kentucky could absolutely go out there and just lay another egg. And so I think you're just looking to Will Levis, looking to Chris Rodriguez, looking to Mark Stoops and just saying, hey, go out there and see if you can actually execute. But it's going to be tough. I agree with you. I think Missouri's defense has been impressive up until this point. And so it's just whether or not Kentucky is able to go out there and do what they were doing earlier this year. And I think it's definitely fair to say that that's not going to happen.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that's just kind of my gut prediction right now. This is a real toss-up game to me. Like you say, I think these are really similar teams statistically, even though defensively it looks a lot different just in terms of style and scheme and all that stuff. But yeah, I just have a weird feeling that the home field will make a difference here. If it was in Lexington, I certainly would pick Kentucky. I think that's how close this ball game is. I really think the fans can make that kind of a difference, especially in a low scoring sort of slug it out type game like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And something else you have to also keep in mind, 11 a.m. kick. Or 12 Eastern time for some of us here in Lexington. So yeah, it's definitely something you got to keep an eye on as well.
Yep. Well, Lance, I appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, John.
And thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories, instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Find it on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get finer podcasts. So until next time, I'm John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.